The views, information, or opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the University of Hawaii College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources, our funders, or any of the organizations affiliated with this project. Welcome to a Seeds of Wellbeing Experts in the Field podcast, featuring people working in their fields of expertise to provide support for agriculture producers in Hawaii, in the United States, and in some cases around the world. These podcasts are made possible by a grant from the University of Hawaii College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources, also known as CTAHR, and the Seeds of Wellbeing or SOW project, and is supported by a grant from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and the Hawaii Department of Agriculture. In the SOW project, we've talked to a lot of people, almost 400 ag producers on the islands, and talked about their top stressors. And one of the ones that keeps rising to the top is legislative issues. So Georgia has been quite involved with the political side of ag production on Maui. Amy, you were gracious enough to come on and speak with us about things that you're seeing from your perspective. In this episode, we speak with Georgia Pinsky, both a farmer and a farmer resource on the island of Maui, and also Representative Amy Perruso from District 46 of Hawaii's state legislature and a member of the Ag, Finance, and Energy and Environmental Protection Committees. We talk about stressors ag producers have voiced related to legislative issues and also some possible solutions.
Hi there, my name is Georgia Pinsky. I'm tuning in here today from the island of Maui, from the backside of Haleakala, and I am a beginning farmer, and I work in farmer coaching and farm support services. And so I pay a lot of attention to the 30 or so farmers that I'm working with. I'm focused on restoration and restoration and resilience. Those are kind of my filters that I put all of my actions through.
I love those.
Thanks so much. Amy.
Hi, aloha. I wanted to talk a little bit about my personal background, just so everyone kind of knows where I'm coming from. I am kind of new to the legislative process. I've only been in elected office for 4 years. I was a veteran social studies teacher in the DOE, but I feel very much at home on the Ag Committee because I grew up on a ranch. Both of my parents went to UC Davis. I was supposed to go to UC Davis and become a vet, and because it was a pretty intense place. We raised all of our own meat, and we did. It was a lot of work. I understand a farmer's life. I understand ag. That was my whole community growing up, and so I did 4-H my whole life, FFA my whole life. And I feel like it's my roots, and with the ag work now on this committee, I feel like I'm coming back to that, but with a particular lens. I've traveled around the world a lot, and I've been paying attention to the possibilities for different ways of doing agriculture, sustainable regenerative agriculture, that we see not just in the history of Hawaii, but also in other places being kind of brought back to life. So I'm really interested in those approaches, and I think I'm just looking forward to this conversation, to learning more. That's one of the things about this legislative work that I really enjoy, is the learning. So those dispositions have served me well, and I hope they serve my community well.
As I mentioned, the Seeds of Wellbeing or SOW project survey shows that legislative issues are very high on the list of things that are upsetting or distressing to our ag producers in Hawaii. It's a broad topic. Legislative issues can cover a lot of things. So I thought I would just mention a couple that I've heard or we've heard on the project from the folks we've interviewed. And then maybe Georgia, you can add some that I may have forgotten or that you see as priorities in your experience. And then we can talk about some of those. At the top of the list and related is legislative issues related to access to land or zoning, ability to find appropriate ag land that is affordable. There's a general consensus that the priorities are given to developers. The best land is prioritized for developers or the wealthy, and so ag production is at the bottom of the list, and often land is unavailable for ag producers that is necessary for them to do what we want them to do. The ability to live on that land as well has been an issue. Zoning, things related to off-grid living, tiny houses, if it's tiny houses, or waste management solutions that have evolved over the years. Yet legislature and legislation does not seem to be in sync with or has kept pace with those developments. So those are a few things that we've heard regularly in some of the interviews, and our frustrations and worries, actually, and in some cases deep worries and problems and barriers to success for ag producers. But Georgia, do you have some you want to share?
That's a fabulous list, and I just want to expand maybe a little bit on cost of living and living on land you bought. I bought land through a USDA loan myself, and I've now helped about a dozen other farmers purchase their own farm utilizing the USDA direct ownership loan programs. They go up to $600,000. So this is almost enough in many parts of Maui to purchase land. It's adequate on the Big Island, and I'm not as familiar with Oahu and Kauai real estate markets, so I won't comment on that. But here on Maui, it's kind of working. You have to be more creative, and so that includes buying land without a water meter, buying land that's more rural, buying land that was CPR'd, and so possibly doesn't come with a house permit. Those are the ways we find land that is affordable for less than $600,000. Once a farmer buys land through the blessed program of the USDA, they can't live on it until they get a permitted house on it. They're hundreds of thousands of dollars away from being able to live on land they just bought. And all they really want to do is grow food. So we need to find a way to make it okay for ag producers to live on land they own without spending the hundreds of thousands of dollars that's needed to build a permitted house that gets a occupancy permit. They're not looking for that. Many of these people are working on minimalism. They're working on small houses. They're working on off-grid. They're working on a more environmentally pleasing lifestyle. And they don't necessarily need or want a large, real house anyway. So that's first and foremost. Farmers can't afford to pay a mortgage and a rent. It's just not possible. Commuting time is real. Ag theft is real. And the need to kilo or observe your land at dawn, at dusk, in the middle of the night is real. Some people are concerned about people squatting on the land, and I don't understand how you can use the word squatting for land that you own. Possibly you could squat at a beach park or on somebody else's private property. But if you own the land, could we use a term like camping? It doesn't have the same negative connotations. I think that if people want to camp on their own land, and if they are to rent a portable so that we don't have waste management concerns, at least at this point, that should be an easy short-term solution. You want to be an ag producer, live on your land. Simple. I have a couple of farmers who are living in RVs. I've been working with Jared Burkett, who's a senior planner at the Maui County Planning Department. He tells me there is a space in the state zoning that specifically outlaws the use of motorhomes, RVs, or any converted vehicle for living in. I didn't know this. And the farmers that I'm working with, they all think that they are in compliance living in their RVs on their land. They're not at the state level. The county doesn't have any regulations about RVs. So we're looking for suggestions about what the state can do to make it more realistic for ag producers to live on land they own. Land that people are leasing is a whole different topic. But if they've went through the process and the emotional and financial commitment to purchase their own farm, it ought to be like Texas or Iowa or one of these other states where the zoning regulations are not so strict. My colleagues in Montana go, wait a minute, you can't live on the land you own? A second piece of this is the capitalistic culture of real estate. And I want to just step way back to the meta perspective of, can the state legislature reevaluate what we mean by highest and best use? Because as I read it, highest and best use is a reasonable legal use of vacant land, which is physically and financially feasible, that results in the highest financial value. Sometimes the highest value is not the best use. So can we separate highest use from best use? Because that's one of the things that's making it impossible to get farmers on land, particularly here on Maui. I don't know where that definition comes from or who sets that definition, or if the state legislature does even have the capacity to make that recognition. But having the word highest and the word best be synonyms as though they mean the same thing is really messing up the way property values work. Somebody the other day, I think out of Hawaii Farmers Union chapter Puna, said something about anti-speculator laws and brought up that in New England they have such a thing. I had never heard of it, and I think it would be something that would be fabulous to explore. Hana Ranch just went up for sale. It sold 10 years ago for $10 million and is now on the market for $75 million. If we had some anti-speculator laws in place, possibly we could mitigate this kind of thing in some way.
I think you're up, Amy.
I mean, let me first speak to kind of the issues that she brought up and the issues that you brought up. So access to land and zoning, I think it's not just a matter of private land and purchasing land. That's one aspect, but what I've really been focused on is the frustration around access to public lands, especially for beginning farmers. And the situation is slightly different on Oahu and Kauai because we have extensive thousands of acres of ADC land. And I know you may have read some of the work that we've been trying to do around ADC and making that land more available for small farmers who are engaged in sustainable farming practices. And that's a work in progress. We did manage to change the language of the statute so that ADC has to support those who provide for local food consumption, not just privileging export production. So I think, it sounds like a small win, seems like super obvious, but that was a big fight. And I think that access to land for some farmers will follow from those changes, at least on Oahu and in Kauai, and hopefully around some other ag parks that the Department of Ag has. So I want to say that that's one way in which beginning farmers can begin to access land before they take the step of, spending $600,000 or, we do have a cohort, a generation of farmers who need to be scaffolded in, not risking everything all at once, but kind of learning their vocation and getting that under their belt, so to speak. So that, I think it's really important that we address that scaffolding or how we're creating that pipeline. Because even if then they do have access, then will they be able to take advantage of it fully? So I think, I hear both of you kind of coming at the conversation around zoning from a very similar perspective. And I appreciate that perspective. It's one that's informed by, it sounds to me like very neighbor island context, or because I think that what we see here on Oahu is the conversation around reducing permitting and streamlining is framed by a gentleman farmer's kind of perspective. So there is this, it's not just a fear of gentleman farmers abusing these kinds of this loosening of restrictions, but it is the actuality of very wealthy speculators coming in, buying ag land and building whatever they want, because there's so little enforcement from DPP. And this is, I represent a really strong ag community from Wahiawa all the way out to North Shore, Waialua, Mokuleia. It's a very strong ag community. And what they're angry about is the fact that the existing permitting, the existing zoning restrictions and requirements are not being enforced, right? So I think we have to have, and I liked what, you talked about a little bit in terms of reframing the language, like, squatting on one's own land does seem to be, misuse of language. And I do think that when you say that the legislature is not keeping up with the conversation that's happening around folks who are minimalist, right, and trying to actually do the right thing and trying to actually move farming in a direction that moves us away from corporate ag, I agree that the legislature, most of the folks in the legislature are not farmers, don't come from a farming background, and even if they represent rural districts, don't have that background and are not really involved in those really intense conversations. So I would say for you folks to understand, my district is huge. I represent the same number of people. So I have like the same number of votes, one vote, as all of my other colleagues do. But I also represent a lot of land, and they don't represent land. So they don't have direct connection to these issues. And most of my colleagues are representing, if not urban communities, then suburban communities. So that's the reality of the makeup of the power structure in the building where I work, in the House, that there are very few people who are representing rural interests just by the nature of our census process and how we redistrict, right? We do it on the basis of people, not land. And so the number of voices, I just want you folks to understand that the number of voices representing rural interests is very small. And so that's why you don't hear these conversations happening. They're not happening a lot. I will say they're happening a bit. And I think that there are some ways in which we can facilitate kind of a broader education of the whole legislature. Sometimes we do that through bills. One of the ways that we do it in the legislature is through the caucus structure. So I've actually been having a conversation with the chair of the environmental caucus, Nicole Lowen, about creating a subcommittee on sustainable agriculture and food systems, because I'm really passionate about food systems within that caucus. So, and the caucus provides a way to educate legislators who might be interested in the topic, but like you said, like their understanding, and even my understanding, like, I'm not living on Hawaii Island. I'm not living in the most rural parts of Maui. My understanding is shaped by my context, and it's limited. So, but I think that those conversations, what I've seen in the Women's Caucus, in the Keiki Caucus, in the Environmental Caucus, is that these caucus structures give us a context before session starts to come together, identify key issues, and then get something hashed out, like a way to approach a problem through legislation that we all agree can be productive. And I really think that you need to have that consensus building happen before the session starts, because the people who hold the most power in the process are the chairs. So if you have not convinced the chairs that there is some critical mass behind and some urgency behind addressing this problem, it will not get addressed. They will not hear those bills because they don't hear it. Like for them, it doesn't resonate. They feel like this is coming. I don't know where this is coming from. I don't know what constituency this serves. So for me, it's all about doing the homework during the interim, doing that organizing during the interim. And I think that that's where we're starting to see some success, right? We've been working with the Farmers Union and trying to do more work in the interim to build consensus, to get bills introduced by both the House and the Senate. And we are seeing some, like we had this past session, we got legislation on food hubs passed, we got legislation on healthy soils practices, composting passed. So I think that we can continue to build momentum. But I think that it's important to understand that, like, I think that the frameworks that you folks are coming from, and maybe a lot of farmers, are those that are not well understood by people who are serving in the building. So that's kind of like how I would address, just problem solving moving forward. And then specifically, I think the off the grid living and the conversation around waste management and permitting processes and even ag theft. I think it is important to have farmers living on their land. Like for me, it's almost impossible to imagine farming without living on your land. I don't see how that would even work, because let's say you have, there's not a lot of animal husbandry here, but let's say you have a ewe giving birth, like, and you don't live on the land. I don't know how that happens. You have to be there. So yeah, I agree. It's a problem we have to solve. And I'm just trying to help you folks understand, like, the barriers, right? The reluctance to just eliminate existing rules and laws, because the problem of property speculation is real, and it's even more intense on Oahu, I think. And that's what we see ag land being bought up for resorts, for like agritourism, where they're gonna, on Mount Kaala, have zip lines, right? So when we talk about, like, should we ease the permitting on ag land so that they can have RVs there? So there's also that conversation on the North Shore, this conversation around the RVs, that same thing that you want to permit because it would enable, like, people who are legitimately trying to do the right thing, like they just want to be able to be on their land to farm. It's also already being exploited on Oahu for the purposes of serving tourists, right? So creating a different ways in which tourists can be brought into the space. And those folks, those tourists are not working on the land. It's not even like woofing. It's like, it's just living in an RV on the ocean. So the kind of pushback we would get is, that, and it doesn't, the community is not seeing any benefit from that. So we'd have to have like a broader conversation about it. I'm open to the conversation, but I also understand why those rules are in place. So
if we have a great idea, so I'm just throwing this out from the conversation we've just had. Say RVs have a benefit for multiple audiences, right? Say RVs could be a great solution for both tourists that are coming here and have the ability to appropriately use them to camp at a certain location. And at the same time, ag producers could use RVs to live on and work the land where they are. And so if we have an idea like that, just as an example, is what's the best way for me with that, or an ag producer with one of those, an idea like that, to get it recognized, ultimately become something that is passed as a law or a zoning change? Because if I'm like many of us, the ag producers we talked to are either not involved in politics or have given up on it in many cases. So, what would be the ways to do it as simply or easily as possible for them to get more involved with ideas they have and try to move the ag producer agenda forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's been happening is working through the farmers union. I feel like the farmers, the small farmers are starting to coalesce around strategies and coming to consensus on their priorities. And I think that the farmers union is a great avenue. And I also think that farmers can work with their individual legislators. So, but what I would say too is that sometimes the process is short-circuited, right? Because a legislator might not sit on the ag committee, and legislators, especially in the House, tend to they will carry a bill for a constituent, or they will get a bill drafted for a constituent or a group of constituents. But they might not have it. They don't sit on that committee. They don't have the expertise, and they definitely, because the legislature is a part-time job. It's not every legislator that will use the interim to do the homework of making sure the bill is right, talking to all the different stakeholders. Because if you don't do that work during the interim, your bill is going to die in session, right? It's guaranteed because you just haven't done the homework. So it's not enough to go to your legislator and ask them to carry the bill. You also have to, if you see that your legislator doesn't have the capacity to do the homework on that bill, you got to take it to the people you think are going to object. You got to take it to the environmentalists, on various islands, take it to the Sierra Club, take it to Earth Justice, because they all have legitimate concerns about, let's say, the waste being released into the ocean if processes are not properly permitted, and have those hard conversations and document them, and take their feedback as though it's serious and it matters. Because what I've seen is advocates feel very strongly about something, which is great, and it's important to bring that passion into the process, but then to recognize that our laws are almost always the result of compromise. So you have to find the thing that you are willing to, listening to the other side, going to the other side first, saying, what are your objections? What would be the problems with this? And not just the state legislature, at the county, this is really important too. Going to your council members and saying, this I think is important. And these kinds of permitting things can happen at the council level. So as long as you're also addressing, bringing the state into conversation. So there's multiple layers, but going to all of these stakeholders, and this is a lot of work for farmers. They shouldn't have to do this work, which is why the farmers union is so important. And you folks have government relations people working, and they do this work. They go and they work with the different stakeholders. They've been really instrumental in trying to overcome the resistance to food hubs, right? Something that we now understand, great common sense, approach. There was a lot of resistance. This took years to get this legislation passed. The legislation on composting, years. And there's nothing more basic, to understanding healthy soils than composting, right? And it's been in process as long as I've been in office, 4 years. And some people will say that's ridiculous, I'm not willing to go down that path. Well, then 4 years later, 10 years later, you're going to be in the same place you started. So I think that it's important to recognize number one, this process takes time. It takes talking to other humans and understanding their perspectives. And it takes a willingness to compromise and to hear why they hold the positions that they hold, and then how you overcome them. I'll give you an example with the pesticide work. So it's always been really important to me because even in my work with HSTA, I fought really hard for the pesticide buffer zone. And when I came into office, one of the first, our bill died because we had a bill about banning the use of pesticides on DOE campuses, which for me was basic, like very straightforward. How are you going to argue with that? And it died because the chair killed it because the DOE said, oh, we don't use any RUPs on DOE campuses. And I knew that to be a falsehood. And but the chair just killed it anyway, because they took the DOE's word at face value. So after the session ended, I called my own community meeting. I asked the Board of Education to come. I asked the superintendent to come. And we made it clear that, they had misrepresented the truth, and we had very angry community members, but also, we were trying to problem solve, like, why is it that we can't do this from your perspective? And, it was so compelling for the superintendent and the chair of the Board of Education to be in that room and to be confronted with the impact of, having their staff lie to the legislature and lie to the community, that they issued a memo that changed statewide policy that, banned the use of RUPs on DOE campuses. So, and then they, after that kind of hollowed out through exemptions a bit, but not bad. So I just say that because not all change happens at the legislature. It can be like these conversations can start in the legislature, but ultimately, like, not all change happens through the law. So I just think that that's really important. For me, that was a really important lesson. And to think about all the different agencies through which we can make change.
I just wanted to comment that I was at the state legislature 3 times during the session of 2017, meeting independently with legislators about the food hub bill and the beginning farmer training bill, neither of which passed that session. I was also there in 2018 testifying about those same bills. They didn't pass at that time either. So I'm very thrilled about the passage of them here finally in 2022. And I absolutely understand about the commitment and longevity that's required to stick it out with the, I like to say the wheels of government turn slowly. And so you have to be willing to crawl at that pace and answer questions one at a time. It's absolutely a journey of 1,000 miles. One of the things that I've done is I've made a point pre-COVID to go to the ag festivals and those sorts of events where ag community people are gathering, and introduce myself to the elected officials who make a point to come to that event. Recognize them in the crowd, introduce myself, shake their hand, because then when I send them an email months down the road, I can remind them, hey, I met you at this festival and I just wanted to let you know there's this problem. And it might help your email to get more heard or get more traction, to have that personal relationship. And if you continue that relationship building as an activity over time, and if that individual continues to be elected, then you can develop a strong working relationship with those individuals. I have a couple of nice, effective personal relationships with a couple of Maui County Council members. Another thing that I've learned to do, and I don't know if it's effective, but it feels good, is when there's an interesting conversation going on social media, I tag them. I absolutely will tag council members that I know are sympathetic to the conversation, or council members that I know are already working on that topic and might want some of the information, some of the opinions that are being cast in this conversation. I've been doing a lot of that this summer, tagging candidates, because I feel that the candidates who are running for office ought to know what the community is talking about, whether the original question brought them in or not. I'm like, hey, Robin Knox for South Maui Council seat. Robin and I've had some fabulous conversations about water quality. That's her background. She's been working in water quality for 40 years. And so when there's a water conversation going on and somebody's talking about, hey, Maui County has injection wells. They took it all the way to the Supreme Court to get permission to put their sewage in the ocean. I'll tag Robin because I know this is something that she's very well versed on, and she's utilizing that skill in her campaign platform. I don't always get responses when I tag elected officials on social media, but like I said, it feels good because I feel like I'm at least letting them know about the conversation.
I would add to that, I think that's a great strategy. And I think sometimes these online conversations that are really substantive are some of the best conversations. There's some serious learning happening. So I applaud that approach. And then also, this has not been happening, although I think it should. And maybe it's just because I'm a very political person, but I feel like even moving into the general, we have time to pressure candidates because, and I think the farmers union, it requires a certain type of 501c4 designation. You can't be a C3. You have to have a certain kind of organizational designation, but I do think that farmers need to, just like in the populist era and in the progressive period, farmers organized, they had unions. So, and that's where you're going to get powers, through collective organizing. So, and I think it also creates a possibility of setting up a relationship with the electeds, where you can make sure they understand your issues by sending out questionnaires. Honestly, that's the way that a lot of candidates learn about the needs and really the struggles of a lot of different groups of people, is through the questionnaires that they have to answer. So prior to completing the questionnaire, they might not have had a really good understanding of it. But I think that it's something that, someone should consider doing that with your organizing farmers, sending out questionnaires. And maybe you don't endorse candidates right away. Maybe you just make their responses public, and that's just a civic exercise, right? But it's a helpful one because it creates a dialogue around the issues that you care about most. And, I really would love to have that kind of, because it would make my job easier, right? It would raise the level of education in the community and amongst the electeds, so that we're not starting at such a low base, and you don't have to convince the chairs about why different bills need to be heard. There's already a sense yes, we all agree this is, critical issue. Let's talk about this let's talk about this legislation, so.
And those surveys are you're saying are sent out by the union now, or I think Civil Beat does things like that sometimes. Am I right?
Yeah. So Civil Beat does broad things, right? What is your position on tourism? What is your position on different areas? But different groups send out, Sierra Club sends out a questionnaire to all candidates. And if you want the endorsement of the Sierra Club, then you need to make sure that your values are in alignment with Sierra Club's. So you complete this questionnaire and Sierra Club decides if your values are in alignment, and they will endorse you or not endorse you. And I think that process for candidates is, okay, I see elected people as people you have to keep in check. They follow the will of the people, and they really do. They care about getting reelected. So that's the way you kind of remind them who elects them, and who they have to be held accountable to. Because I think that as long as people who are elected are not being held accountable for rhetoric, then that you'll continue to hear lip service about agriculture, and we're never going to really get to these really hard conversations, which is exactly what George is talking about. She's talking about like, these are the basic everyday, like, how do we do ag if we are not living on our own land? It's a core question that legislators don't have to deal with because they're not held accountable to their votes on bills, because those bills are never heard, and they're never even held accountable in questionnaires. Like, how would you vote if this was brought before you? So that's what I'm saying. And maybe, like, again, I come from a teacher union organizing background. So I see things through a particular lens, but I think the answer to this question is organizing. And I think Georgia agrees with me because she's been in the building. Like, she understands how to lobby her legislators. And I'm just saying, like, there's power in numbers, there's powers in collectivity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I hope the Farmers Union continues to gain traction. I did spend some years working with them, but they were struggling with founders syndrome at the time at the upper levels of power there. And as a tiny producer here on Maui, definitely the neighbor island syndrome was hitting hard for that organization. And so I started to, like, just zero in more on focusing on the smaller scale, which is why I've kind of switched to working more with our council members.
Yeah.
But pros and cons. And I enjoy the activity of being at the state legislature and at the Capitol and talking to the elected representatives. It normally feels good. And the question I always start with, is they say, well, what constituency does this serve? And I'm like, well, I think all your constituents eat. End of story. All conversations about how to increase food production serve all constituents, 100% of them.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting process to me how upstream it is and how uphill you have to climb and how much explaining and educating you have to do when people don't seem to totally confront the fact that they eat every day.
Yeah. Well, I mean, honestly, like, I think that there is a certain percentage of the legislature that doesn't think that we're going to be able to move from import dependent to more self-sufficiency. So they don't believe we can do it. So they're not interested in supporting it. So as a matter of fact, like, their understanding of where their food comes from has nothing to do with local farmers. So for them, those two things are not connected. So, I mean, even that, like, reconnecting that is another piece of the struggle, right? So, but what I was saying too, like, it's not just I'm not thinking just about the farmers union. It's also the co-ops. I think, like Jim was saying, the co-ops are emerging as a force. And I think that as you see the food hubs get put in place, farmers will be less isolated. There'll be collective spaces where they can work and process food. And I think that's going to contribute to collective organizing because they have shared interests. So I'm hopeful about, I don't think it should be just situated in the farmers union. For me, that's a natural place to start, but also I think we're already starting to see it happening with the co-ops.
In Georgia, I think you mentioned there were a couple that you're working with on island that you think are chipping away at that. Is that right?
Yeah, and I work with Teresa Young out of the Kohala Center. She works with agribusiness and she's a co-op designer. Actually just had a fabulous coaching session this morning with a young man who's been working in oyster mushroom production for the better part of 2 decades. He'd like to form a mushroom growers co-op. So it's a really cool conversation. And local boy style. He's all over the map, but the intentions are there, the passion is there, and the skill base is there. So he's, engaged with me as a farmer coach to help him bring structure and financial projections to his visions. So it felt like a really good collaboration this morning. With regards to where food comes from, that kind of takes us right into the infrastructure discussion. Over the last few decades, as Hawaii transitions away from plantation agriculture, agricultural infrastructure has been allowed to crumble. Here on Maui, we lost the dairy, we lost the egg farm. There are no more fish markets except for Whole Foods. There are no more butchers except for the one. Decoit meat packing house and cattle company is very limited. On top of that, the government has been working fabulously to improve and expand food safety regulations, including GAP, the Good Agricultural Practices, or FSMA, Food Safety Modernization Act. The compounding result of crumbling infrastructure and improved food safety regulations is that many farmers and ranchers are limited by a lack of access to proper facilities to support their efforts to increase local food supply. And so, what steps can, the food hubs is a huge step in that direction with regards to the need for increased local food aggregation and distribution opportunities. Some of these farmers are so small that while they have something to contribute, it's not enough to be their own commercial operation. And so they need their production to go into a larger aggregation facility to then be distributed out with others of its kind. And so that's something that I hear about a lot, is how can I collaborate even with non-food products. I have a flower farmer who does non-tropical flowers like petunias and such, and she wants to form a non-tropical flower co-op because they need to get enough of the same kind and color of flower at one place at one time to be able to, for example, do a wedding at one of the large resorts. And so bringing those ag crops together into large enough quantity to be utilized even by the DOE, working with the School Garden Network and the Farm to School program, and getting enough of any one thing together to be able to serve the students across the state. I think the food hubs are going to be a huge solution to that, and a great step in the right direction. But what other kinds of steps is the legislature looking at to increase the availability of wash pack facilities, slaughter facilities, certified kitchen facilities, and the like?
Yeah, so I think that, we had an amazing surplus last session, and our economic forecast is pretty positive for the next 2 years or so. And I think the kinds of investments the legislature is, should be looking at, or what they tend to look at when you have these kinds of surpluses, are the kinds of investments that are exactly what you're talking about, infrastructure, because they're one-time costs. They're not labor, they're not positions that they'll be paying for 20, 30, 40 years. That said, we didn't see a lot of infrastructure requests coming through the legislature because almost all of the ones that came through got funded. So I had put one in we have never had, since the 1990s, there's been a report on the need for a native fish hatchery to support native fish ponds in Hawaii since 1992. We've never done it. So I put in a request to establish that at Waianae High School, and it was funded because we had the money. But people are not working with their legislators. So there's two avenues. One is the CIP. So that is essentially like building money. Like if you're going to build something, if it's about infrastructure, you submit a CIP request, and your legislator, both your representatives and your senator, have a certain number of CIP requests that they can submit and get approved every session. And though I would recommend that people that's like the best possible route, is having the farmers that want to, for example, have an aggregation facility, have them get together and go talk to whoever the representative is for that district and say, this is a high interest, high need, high urgency. We need this, and we are seeking state funding for this. So that's one possibility. The other is GIAs. And so those are, and I'm sure you know what this is, but just for the audience that might not know, are the grants and aids that we provide for nonprofits to do their work. And this would not necessarily be limited to physical infrastructure or building something. This could, support the work of a nonprofit. Like if, for example, the kind of work that you're doing, mentoring beginning farmers, or not even a beginning farmers, but someone who wants to develop a co-op, that can be financially supported by the state through the GIA structure, through nonprofits. So those are two like immediate avenues that are already available. And then you can also work with your legislator to submit a bill that calls for, it can be a CIP bill, or it can be, a separate bill that just has funding attached for the creation of this thing, which is how we did the fish hatchery. We didn't use the CIP route or the GIA route. We just, we introduced a bill, Senator Shimabukuro introduced it, and it just had funding attached for that particular facility to be built, and for training for the teachers who are going to run it. So be thinking about what you want, design it, plan it, bring your legislator into this loop, and if the legislator thinks it's important for the community, then they can include it as part of their package. And I think that's the other part of the lift, right? Like helping your legislator understand why this is important, why it should be. That we only get in the House, we only get 20 bills. So maybe your senator is going to be a better person to introduce it, because they have unlimited number of bills that they can introduce. And I think if you do something that's statewide, like the Farmers Union did with the food hubs, it took a long time, but now and it's just a pilot that's in place, but it's a pilot that's in place that has kind of established a framework for a statewide network of food hubs. So that's, I think, a more ambitious approach, but ultimately more fruitful, because it creates an understanding that we're not just going to do this in one particular district. We want to do this in all the areas where it makes sense. So I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, and it sounds like, from what I'm hearing you say, it sounds like timing is important. So can you share some of the timing that folks should be aware of for deadlines when they should start to educate or collaborate with some of their legislators?
Yeah, I will say that, the election cycle is not helpful, especially this year because of the census and redistricting. Everybody has to run. And I think it's healthy, it's good, it's democracy, right? We should be running for our seats. We should be back in the communities talking to our constituents, but it does give us less time to work on subject matter, on our bills, on getting ready for session. So I think that we walk into session not as well prepared right after an election. That's my sense, my interpretation, probably shared by nobody else. But that makes timing even more important in these election years. So I would not talk to anybody before August 13th. And then I would start talking to whoever made it through the primaries. I would talk to like whoever you think is going to get elected, or whoever you think will champion the bills, and also talk to the current electeds, because it's part of our job. We're still doing our job. We're still working for the people, even though we're also running for office. So the bills that we're working on, like if I don't get reelected, I'm handing them off to my successor, in the hopes that they will see that community need there and also champion those bills. So, but I would say that like before the primary is probably not great timing, but to approach them after the primary and well before November, right? Because it takes a while. Number one, education takes time. And then let's say you have an idea, you have to shop it out, right? Like I was talking, you got to shop it around, you got to have meetings. And it sounds like dreary, kind of bureaucratic, mundane, but these conversations are really important. You do not want to be hearing a bill and have one of the key stakeholders say, no, we would never have agreed to that because that's ludicrous because A, B, and C. If you hear that conversation in a hearing, that bill's dead. And it won't come back to life that session. So it's really important to do the work, like get all those things hammered out before session starts. And then it can be introduced, and then you can get other legislators to sign on and to support it. And I would definitely not take for granted that your legislator is going to do that work to get other legislators to support your bill. You also need to be having conversations, if you can, with at least the legislators on your island to understand, like, this is something the whole delegation from our island should be moving because A, B, and C,
And just what legislation? Sorry.
At the legislature, we kind of recognize, we defer to delegations, right? So if the Maui delegation says something is very important for their delegation in our body in the House, we hear that, so, okay, I mean, explain why, but, so that's the thing that happens, is organizing around island delegations. So that's in terms of timing, that's what I would say, like have the bill drafted, ready to go, ready to talk to electeds. I mean, have all that homework done, those conversations done before November, because once they get into office, then there's a whole nother set of things that there's like a scurry. There's a lot of upheaval in an election year, getting ready for opening day and deciding like who's going to be on which committees and who's going to chair which committees. And there's all this like factional organizing. So you're not going to have your legislators' attention, is what I'm saying.
And you said during
that work happened between August and November.
Okay, but then the legislative session, am I right in saying it's January to April? Is that?
Yep, January to April.
And so during that session, it's a matter of paying attention to bills, trying to put in testimony, trying to rally others to do so as well. So you want to put on the pressure then as well, but having backfilled it or initially laid the groundwork with all the information before November. Okay.
And those conversations are the way that you are going to have people come testify. Because if everybody feels ownership of this, like all the stakeholders, when we see, for example, when we see the Farm Bureau and the Farmers Union and the Department of Ag and, all of our, like some of our small farmers, usually for the small farmers, there's only a smattering of people who testify. But we see all those people saying, yes, this is important. We all agree. That bill is going to fly through, right? So, because those people have gotten that consensus built at the back end and they're coming in like just to tell the legislators, we all agree, this is why we want to do this, and let's move forward together.
Well, I just was wondering, I didn't participate in this last legislative session at all. And I'm wondering if post-COVID, if there's now a way for Neighbor Island residents to testify without having to travel to Honolulu. Is that true?
Yeah, it's so exciting. And I think it changes everything. We didn't have, so what the leadership of the House and Senate have always used as resistance to this kind of system, right, virtual testimony, is that we will be inundated with testimony and we will never go home and we'll be in the hearings till midnight. And it never transpired. So we still had the same people testifying, generally a little bit more, but and they didn't have to fly in, and we could hear them and it was fine, and we could ask questions. And turns out you don't need to be in the building to make a difference.
Awesome. Thank you for that. That's really motivating for myself and many of my colleagues, because as a small farmer, finding the time, honestly, more than finances, the time to travel to Honolulu is just not there. And so I think that will make it a lot more realistic for for people to get involved in the legislative process during session. And what I was going to add to your suggestions is if you do want to meet individually with one of your elected officials, try to do so in late January or in the first 2 or 3 weeks of February. After that, it's basically too late to have an impact on the choices that your legislator is going to make during that session. So if you are going to make the effort to meet with your senator or meet with your House rep about a particular bill that's been introduced, and you want to make the effort to fly to the Capitol, or you want to meet with them virtually, you want to do that right away in the first 3 or 4 weeks of the legislative session. Otherwise, just sit back and watch the show and chime in next January.
Yeah, and there's a window for that too, right? Because we start session, but then there's a deadline for bills to be introduced, but then they have to be assigned to committees. So you won't even know who to talk to or if bills are going to be heard until there's this sweet window, like in late January, early February, I think. Middle of January. Yeah. So you're right. There's a window if you want to talk to your legislator in person, but also legislators have become very accustomed to virtual meetings. So I would say it's much more common for me now to talk to constituents virtually, just because it's more efficient for them. There's kind of still a fear of COVID, and that happened all session, and legislators are super used to it. So, and some of them prefer it. Some of our legislators are older, and it's less exhausting for them, and doesn't, it keeps them safe. So something to consider, especially if you're a neighbor island.
I know we're running to the end of our session, but I wanted to kind of circle back to the Seeds of Wellbeing project as kind of a closing thought and some closing statements, and the idea of farmer wellness. And I'm reading some national articles yesterday in a farmer science journal called Farm Well, about the emotional support and the pressure release that farmer mentors, advisors, and coaches can provide for farmers to give them the feedback, the focus, and the ongoing motivation to stick with it. And so I've been looking at the idea of, on a larger scale, could the state health and the state mental health folks cross over into agriculture and recognize that at the international and also national level, we're starting to have a crisis in mental health with ag producers. I don't think we're having that here yet, but as I expand my perspective of what good mental health entails, I think I'm actually seeing it in the spouses of many of the farmers that I'm working with. And so that's one of the things that the Seeds of Wellbeing project is including, that some of the other more national studies have not, which is that how do the stressors ripple effect into the families who may or may not be directly working on the farm? And so how can the state legislature kind of maybe take some actions before we have a crisis here in Hawaii to make sure that our producers are getting the check-ins, the mental health check-ins that they need from people who are educated to watch for the signs and symptoms and to get them the support that they need before that crisis kind of hits Hawaii. So it's just kind of my final note to you.
Yeah. So can I quickly say something? I don't know what our time, are we on a hard stop or?
I'm not if you're not.
Okay, good. Yeah, okay. Let's keep going. Because I think that's a really important insight, and one that should lead us to legislation. So again, we're coming back to, what is the distance we need to travel between talking about how important we think ag is and then actually supporting farmers. And I think that you're pointing to a really important component of that support. I think that what you're talking about looks like a bill, and I don't think that it's something that the Department of Health is likely to take up, because they will see themselves as being very distinct in terms of their areas of responsibility. I think and they wouldn't necessarily even understand how to address these sources of stress for farmers. I think that what I would like to do is to reconceptualize the Department of Ag. So right now, it's really a regulatory agency. It's not supporting farmers. We need to shift the whole department so that not only are we like funding them so they can fill their positions, and we're making those positions pay well enough so that the farmers can get those resources that they used to get. Like farmers used to be supported here, but also to expand our definition of support. So we're really talking about mentoring. We're really talking about mental health. We're really talking about like addressing the sources of stress that these farmers and their families are experiencing. Because without that kind of support, people are not going to stay in farming. You know, it's just like, it's the same kind of cycle with teachers. If they're not supported to reach that level of comfort and proficiency and success, then they won't stay. So I think that that's critical, and I'd be happy to work on something like that with you. And just so kind of you understand, like my larger mission is to shift the whole department from regulatory to supportive. Because I think that without that kind of shift, the Department of Ag is like, that's not our job, you know?
And that can be done that to me sounds like a national bill, but you're saying that could be done at a state level?
That should be done at the state level. And it could be like some of the counties are really out in front. Maui, your city council right now is very progressive and is doing a lot of things around farming. I'm good friends with the progressives on your council. And they're doing good work. They could, if they wanted to, kind of take this up too. But I think what's more productive for the whole system is to address it on a statewide basis and to really look at like how we can transform the Department of Ag. So it's not just regulatory. They're not just telling people when they broke the rules, but they're actually supporting farmers. They become a vehicle for investment. Right now, they're not even a vehicle for investment into our farmers in a really systematic way. They have a grants program, but it's, you know, like it's not what we should be seeing. Like all of these proposals that you're talking about, you know, the slaughterhouses, the aggregation facilities, all of that should be part of the governor's budget from the Department of Ag. The Department of Ag should be saying, these are the ways in which we can support farmers. That they're not doing that. They're saying, we want to keep our department small and regulatory. So you need to have a governor who's ambitious about ag, and he will appoint people who are ambitious about ag. So that's the first battle for me, like the governor.
I love that your answer brought in the HDOA, because I wasn't even sure if I wanted to go there, because so many people are honestly depressed by the trajectory of the Hawaii Department of Agriculture, you know. And then there was a moment, I think it was just right when COVID hit, so in March of 2020, when the governor came out and made some fabulous speeches about increasing local ag and supporting the local producers. And I got a lot of emails that week about, wow, the help is finally coming. And then the budget came out later that summer, and the HDOA's budget had actually been reduced. And it was so conflicting to the information that we'd received in the public speeches earlier that spring. I then got a lot of phone calls of people going, wow, they don't actually have our back, do they? We're in this on our own. And so it's really great to hear the recognition that the HDOA needs shoring up, needs further funding, needs support, needs a direction shift, you know, needs to be restored in a sense, the department itself.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I would say, restored.
But the one thing I will say, Amy, is it feels so daunting to see that. I mean, it can take, you know, Georgia mentioned she's tried for years and years to help support these bills. And to me, it seems like how many years, you know, the question that comes to mind for me is it 10 years, 20 years before such a change in the Department of Ag could actually happen?
Okay, so I want to address that though, because I don't want to leave on a note of hopelessness. And I think that it's explicable, like it's totally explainable. We have not, so a lot of time legislators say like, you know, the legislature has so much power, but in reality, the governor drives the agencies. And if you don't have the legislature will never pass bills that the agencies say like, oh, we can't do that. Like, if the energy has to come from the governor and the agencies, because the legislature will never pass something that the agencies won't accept, because we know that if we pass it, it'll just sit there. It'll never get implemented. It'll just be a waste of time, and it'll just make people feel worse. So I would say right now, there's nothing more important than the gubernatorial race and holding all of those candidates accountable to all of the rhetoric that they are, using around ag. Where's their plan? What is their plan for the Department of Ag? Nobody has asked a candidate that, not once. So we need to have that conversation. And some people have offered vision. Vision is not plan. What is your plan? What bills would you pass first? What kinds of people would you appoint to the Board of Agriculture, the Board of ADC? Like all those things seem like they're invisible and they don't matter, but they matter a lot. And they are like all of those decisions made by the governor, his appointments, his vision, his plan, his budget. That's why we don't have any movement, because I love David Ige. He's a nice guy and he helped public education, but he is a fiscal conservative, and everything for him, like he's very old school. Like it's been a hard conversation to get him to the place where he thinks that local food production is important. I really think that we have so much work to do, and but I don't want it the reasons for our failures thus far to be mysterious. For me, it's very clear. Those agencies have to want to support agriculture, not just regulate, support, invest, be a huge engine. And we need a governor that's going to do that work. So that's what I would say to people is like, make that the most important question. So you say you support ag. What does that look like for you?
Big, broad question. If you don't want to answer, you don't have to, but in a yes, no kind of way, do you think there are any gubernatorial candidates running this year who care about ag?
Yeah.
Okay, good. That's a good.
I do. I think I've heard, yeah. I think that I think Kaikahele cares about ag because he comes from Hilo. He comes from a small farming, fishing village, and I think that he is connected to people who are doing ag. Those are his relationships, and I would say that he brings that up in conversation as if it's a priority. He's talked about vision, and I like his vision, but similarly, I haven't heard a plan. He's talked about the kinds of people who would appoint to the Board of Education. He has not talked about the kinds of people he would appoint to his department and his Board of Agriculture and ADC. Nothing, crickets. So I love Kai, but still, the candidates are not being forced to do enough on this issue. And part of it is right now, the weakness of the farmer organizing. Like there are other, like ACLU, they had a forum, gubernatorial candidates came, they talked about their positions on, prison reform, judicial reform, these kinds of issues. And nobody has forced the candidates to do anything around farming, ag, aquaculture, anything.
Why does the Farmers Union not holding any kind of a forum or developing a slate of candidates that they feel that would support the initiatives of the Farmers Union?
I don't know. I mean, that's a good question.
That's why.
Yeah, I don't know. And I think that it could be like a collaboration. Like the Farmers Union could do that with the Farm Bureau, because they're going to have similar kinds of questions. They serve similar overlapping constituencies. But this is a food systems questions. Like, why aren't the food systems people calling for that? Why aren't the farm to school people calling for that? I think in part because each of these groups by themselves doesn't have that kind of confidence. Can we do that? Didn't know we could do that.
Well, one thing I'll put out there is that one of my takeaways is it sounds like if you're going to put energy into something, it should be, I think you called them lever topics, key lever topics. I'm not sure what that term means, but is it something that pulls the lever?
Well, something that uses the lever to move other things.
Okay.
Right?
Okay, so got it. So are there lever topics that either of you can think of that those listening may want to grab onto and maybe spearhead the fight around making that become either a GIA request, a CIP request, or a bill, right? Or those are options?
Yeah.
Yes, any topics that you think are really going to be lever topics that will help move the needle?
I'll say the slaughterhouse conversation has to happen. We've been having it for too long. Like that can change everything, especially when we're talking about feral animal management. So that's something, one small change, seemingly small change that can have a big impact, a big ripple effect. I think the food hubs was one. And, honestly, it just, to me, I keep coming back to land management. So I want to rewrite the law so that the leases that we award are specifically, if you're going to be using state land, you will be producing food for local consumption, period, end of story. I think that it'll change things overnight. All of this land is being used for seed crops, seed corn primarily, and for export production. So those two things right now are like kind of top of mind for me, but I have a broad palette. I'm open to a lot of things. So
definitely, I was going to say infrastructure. The infrastructure issues come up on a regular basis because the codes and zoning laws are so overlapping at the federal, state, county, shoreline management. All of those codes kind of overlap, and it can be very difficult and time consuming for a farmer to figure out how to get those kinds of infrastructures on their own land. And so they need those available either through county or state facilities, much like community centers, if you will. I spent 10 years on the Big Island, and there were a few certified kitchens that belonged to the state that people could rent, and they were here, there, and everywhere along the Hamakua coast. And it seemed like a great way for people to be small kind entrepreneurial, taking their bananas and making banana bread, and therefore having a higher price point. And it's something lacking on Maui. So I know that those can be useful. Also, the slaughterhouses conversation, there are quite a number of mobile slaughterhouse units on the Big Island, compliments of the work of CTAHR agent Michael DuPont, if I'm not mistaken. And those have been extremely successful for small livestock producers on the Big Island. And we are avidly awaiting a couple of those types of units here on Maui. And definitely the slaughterhouse issue chimes right in on the feral animal issue. They are directly connected. So that's where you get something that you might call a lever issue, because it has the leverage to get backers from outside the ag community who are worried about feral animal and find a solution possibly that works for a broader constituency.
We thank Amy and Georgia for their candor and insights into the very real issues our ag producers in Hawaii face related to legislative issues. In our interviews with Hawaii ag producers, there are a number of barriers to success and frustrations that need to be addressed, so we hope this open dialogue has been of some assistance. So any closing thoughts from each of you? Just what would you have to say to ag producers that are clearly stressed out by legislative issues that they're having to deal with or that are not in place? And any final thoughts, Amy?
Yeah, I would say the way to overcome those feelings, and again, like this is just coming from my experience, is to get involved in the fight. And I know that it's easy to feel overcome by anxiety and powerlessness and hopelessness. But I think that there are other people in the same situation, so same subject position, and organizing with others and finding common ground. I think that's the most, regardless of the outcome, like, right, it took more than 5 years to get food hubs passed, more than 5 years to get the beginning farmers mentoring and support system passed. And so it's not that the gratification is going to be instant, but you will also find solidarity in organizing with others. And I think that sometimes is more important for your well-being than the outcome of the legislative session, because you find your power by fighting for what you want. So that's what I would say.
So think of it more like planting an ulu tree. You're not going to have it's not going to bear fruit for a number of years, but you got to start somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah.
How about you, Georgia?
I'm never quite sure what to tell people when they're struggling. I think don't bite off more than you can chew. Focus. Pick one part of your challenge that you think you can make a difference on, and make a difference on that one this week. You're only you can only do so much today, and then you need to sleep, and the sun will come up again tomorrow, and you'll do what you can do tomorrow. So you're never going to get it all done today. And absolutely, the ulu tree analogy is perfect. You're working on building not just a business that can support you and your family today, but you're working on building an agricultural industry in Hawaii that doesn't exist today. And that's why it feels hard. It's big. We're all in this big project right now. There has never been this kind of small, diversified, successful agricultural industry in Hawaii before. We're leaving the days of plantation behind, and they're still fading. And we moved from plantation agriculture into tourism. And the transition from tourism into small scale diversified agriculture is going to be a rough one. But I believe that those two industries can support one another mutually and naturally. I think the upward trend of foodies traveling, and people who do want to know where their food comes from, and visitors who want to eat local and are willing to make the extra effort to experience the local agricultural industry, that's on the rise. So look for those opportunities. Look for those moments when you can share with people about what you're doing. Your story is important, and people do want to know what you're doing and why. Keep the passion going.
The intention of this podcast series is to create a safe space for respectful and inclusive dialogue with people from across a broad and diverse spectrum involved in growing and making accessible the food we share together. A diversity of voices, perspectives, and experiences can serve to deepen mutual understanding, to spark creative problem solving, and provide insight into the complexities of our agricultural system. If you, our listeners, have experiences with Hawaii agricultural ecosystems, from small holder farms to large, even including multinational agricultural industrial companies, or anywhere in between, and you would like to share your story, please contact us. We welcome your voices and perspectives.